The hum of fluorescent lights overhead echoed the monotony of Anne's days. At 53, her life had become a rhythm of predictability. A quiet house, a quiet job, and quiet evenings spent with books that often went unread. Widowhood had left her drifting, unmoored from the purpose she once found in family dinners, shared laughs, and stolen moments of intimacy with her late husband. She had come to accept her solitude, even if it wasn't the life she had once imagined for herself. The grocery store was her one break from the silence, though even that was more task than reprieve. She knew the aisles by heart, the shelves stacked with the same brands she had been buying for decades. On most visits, she moved on autopilot, her thoughts elsewhere, until that day, and was reaching for a bag of oranges, her hand brushing against another's. She turned startled, and found herself looking into the warm, hazel eyes of a man at least 20 years her junior. His smile was disarming, boyish yet confident, and it held none of the awkwardness she might have expected from such a moment. "Sorry about that," he said, stepping back with a sheepish grin. "Didn't mean to ambush your oranges." She laughed despite herself, the sound unfamiliar in her own ears. "No ambush," she replied. "Plenty to go around." He chuckled, his laughter rich and contagious. "Good to know. I wouldn't want to start a produce war," and felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. She noticed how easily he carried himself, his shoulders broad but relaxed, his presence magnetic in a way that made the grocery store's sterile environment feel oddly alive. They exchanged a few more pleasantries before parting ways, and Anne told herself it was nothing, a fleeting interaction with a kind stranger. But as she pushed her cart down the cereal aisle, she caught herself glancing back, her heart inexplicably lighter. For the first time in years, her routine didn't feel quite so mundane. What was it about him? His charm? His warmth? Or perhaps it was the sheer novelty of being noticed in a way that didn't feel dismissive or transactional. Whatever it was, she carried it home with her, replaying the brief exchange as she unpacked her groceries, a small smile lingering on her lips. And didn't know it yet, but that moment would mark the beginning of a story she never thought she'd live, a story that would upend her carefully contained world and remind her that even in the quietest corners of life, there is room for unexpected light. The next time Anne saw him, it was almost by accident, or so she told herself. It had been a week since their chance encounter, and though she'd been to the grocery store twice since, she hadn't spotted him. On this particular morning, she lingered by the produce section, pretending to debate between apples and pears. She almost gave up when she heard a familiar voice behind her, still deciding on oranges, and turned, her heart skipping a beat. There he was, dressed casually in a gray hoodie and jeans, his smile as easy as she remembered. "Just branching out," she replied, holding up a pear. "But they're not quite as contentious, are they?" He laughed, and the sound was just as infectious as before. "I'll admit, oranges have a flair for drama." Their conversation flowed naturally, picking up where they had left off without the awkwardness of strangers. She learned his name, Liam, and that he was a graphic designer who worked freelance. He learned hers, and when she told him she was a retired teacher, he nodded with a respect that felt genuine. "What did you teach?" he asked. "English," she said. "Mostly literature." His eyes lit up. "So, you're the reason I had to suffer through Shakespeare in high school." And feigned offense. "Suffer? Don't tell me you weren't moved by Romeo and Juliet." "Moved to sleep, maybe," he teased, then softened. "But honestly, I think I just didn't get it. The whole love at first sight thing felt a little unrealistic." "Maybe," Anne said, her voice quieter now. "But sometimes it's not about the logic of it. It's about how it makes you feel in the moment." Their eyes met, and Anne felt a strange vulnerability pass between them. She cleared her throat, suddenly self-conscious. "Anyway, Shakespeare's not for everyone." They chatted for a while longer before parting ways, but this time Liam suggested they meet for coffee sometime. Anne hesitated, the suggestion catching her off guard, but then she nodded. That would be nice. The days following their coffee meeting blurred into something Anne couldn't quite name. They met up more frequently, sometimes for a quick chat, sometimes for long conversations that stretched over hours. He told her about his favorite books, his childhood in the countryside, and his dreams of traveling more. She told him about her years of teaching, the places she'd once dreamed of visiting, and the quiet life she'd built since retiring. Liam had a way of drawing her out, of making her laugh, of making her feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. The moments they spent together were light and easy, yet they carried an unexpected weight, a feeling and couldn't quite explain, as if her life were shifting, one small interaction at a time. And didn't know when the shift began, but one day, it was simply undeniable. It was a sunny afternoon, and they were sitting on a bench in the park. Liam had brought coffee for them, a habit he'd taken up after discovering her favorite order. The light filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the path before them. He was gesturing animatedly, describing a particularly challenging project, and she found herself smiling, not at the story but at him. She noticed the way his hair caught the sunlight, the slight crinkle at the corners of his eyes when he laughed, the energy that seemed to radiate from him. There was something about the ease of his presence, the warmth he carried, that made her chest tighten in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. And Liam's voice cut through her thoughts. She blinked, realizing he had asked her a question. "Sorry, what was that?" He grinned. "Lost you for a second there. I was saying, what about you? What's something you've always wanted to try but haven't?" The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, feeling suddenly exposed. "Oh, I don't know," she said lightly. "I'm not very adventurous." "Come on," he pressed gently. "There's got to be something." And thought for a moment. "I guess I've always wanted to take a road trip. Just pack up and go, with no set plan." Liam nodded, his face thoughtful. "So why not do it?" She laughed softly. "It's not that simple. Life gets in the way. Responsibilities, expectations." "Maybe," he said, his voice quieter now. "But sometimes, life's too short to wait." His words settled into the space between them, heavier than she expected, and felt her chest tighten again, this time with an ache she couldn't quite name. That evening, as she lay in bed, her thoughts refused to settle. She replayed their conversations, his laughter, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. And then it hit her. The realization was like a jolt, a mix of exhilaration and dread. She liked him, more than liked him. Somewhere along the way, her feelings had deepened, sneaking up on her when she wasn't looking. And sat up in bed, her heart racing. "No," she whispered aloud, as if saying it would make it less true. He was younger, so much younger, and this was absurd. But denying it didn't make the feeling go away. If anything, it only made it sharper. Her mind swirled with questions. What would he think if he knew? Was she foolish to even entertain the thought? Would people look at her differently, judge her? And pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed. She hadn't felt this way in decades, not since her youth, when love was all-consuming and rules didn't seem to matter. She fell asleep that night with a strange mix of emotions. Fear, joy, and the undeniable pull of something she couldn't yet define. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for Anne. Every time she saw Liam, her heart raced with an intensity she hadn't felt in years. But her joy was tangled with doubt, and the weight of questions she couldn't escape. One morning, as she stood in the kitchen stirring her coffee, her thoughts overwhelmed her. "This can't be real," she told herself for the 100th time. "He's too young. It's inappropriate. What would people think? What would he think?" Her reflection in the kitchen window stared back at her, older and lined with years of experience and heartbreak. She couldn't ignore the voice in her head whispering, "You're past this. You're too old for these kinds of feelings." But then she'd remember the way he smiled at her, how he listened with genuine interest, how he made her feel alive again in ways she thought were long buried. It was confusing and exhilarating, and she was terrified of what it all meant. That afternoon, they met again at the grocery store, their usual place. He greeted her with a warm, easy smile, and she felt her worries momentarily dissolve. They walked the aisles together, chatting about everything and nothing. "And can I ask you something?" Liam said suddenly, stopping near the fruit section. "Of course," she said, trying to sound calm, though her heart was thudding in her chest. "Do you believe people can find happiness at any age?" His tone was casual, but his eyes were searching hers, as though the answer mattered more than she realized. The question caught her off guard. She looked at him, trying to decipher what he meant. I think so. At least, I hope so," she replied honestly. He nodded thoughtfully. I think so too. It's just about being brave enough to reach for it, don't you think? Her breath caught at his words, and something shifted in her chest. Was he trying to tell her something? Or was she reading too much into it? The ambiguity of their interactions, the way every word seemed layered with unspoken meanings, was driving her mad. That night, she sat alone in her living room, a glass of wine in hand. The house felt too quiet, too big. She thought of Liam's words, of the way he looked at her, and a wave of longing washed over her. But just as quickly, doubt crept in. What if this is all in your head? The voice whispered. He's kind because he's young, because he's kind to everyone. Don't make it into something it's not. Her mind was a storm of conflict. On one hand, she wanted to believe there was something real between them, something that transcended age or societal expectations. On the other, she couldn't shake the fear of being foolish, of misreading the situation and embarrassing herself, and sighed, setting down her glass. She didn't have answers, only questions that circled endlessly in her mind. All she knew was that Liam had awakened something in her she thought was long gone, a spark of hope, of possibility. And though the uncertainty was overwhelming, a small part of her wondered, what if? And spent the next few days in a haze, caught between excitement and hesitation. Each time she saw Liam, the tension in her chest grew heavier, part curiosity, part fear of what lay beyond the surface of their friendship. She'd never expected to find herself here, in this confusing, thrilling place. It felt as if she were standing on the edge of something big, something transformative, but she wasn't sure whether to step forward or retreat. The thought of inviting Liam over had lingered in the back of her mind for a while, but it had felt too bold, too forward. What would he think of me? She questioned. What if he's just being polite? What if I'm reading everything wrong? But as each day passed, the idea began to seem less impossible and more natural. Her home was quiet, and for the most part, she was content with that solitude. But in Liam's presence, and felt a warmth she hadn't realized she missed. He wasn't like anyone she'd known before. It wasn't just his youth. It was the ease with which he made her laugh, the way he listened, the way he saw her, really saw her, beyond the lines and years. She sat down at the kitchen table one morning, a half-empty cup of coffee before her. Her fingers drummed lightly against the surface as her thoughts raced. What if I invited him over for dinner? It seemed like a simple enough idea. They could talk, enjoy a quiet evening, and maybe, just maybe, she could get a better sense of where they stood. Was it friendship? Or was it something more? Something more dangerous? Her heart skipped a beat at the thought. Dangerous, she realized, because at her age, nothing was simple. Nothing was without consequence. She'd been divorced for years, her life filled with the quiet hum of routine. The prospect of shaking that up, of stepping into unknown, unpredictable territory was daunting. But then again, the quiet had become a cage, hadn't it? A place where her desires were buried under layers of complacency. And now, with Liam, those desires had resurfaced in ways she wasn't prepared for. She wanted to know him better, to see where this connection might lead, if anywhere at all. That evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and orange, and picked up the phone. Her fingers hovered over the keypad for a long moment. What if he says no? She thought. What if he thinks I'm crazy? But the thought of living with the regret of not asking was unbearable. Slowly, she dialed his number. Hello. Liam's voice was warm, comforting as always. Hi, Liam. It's Anne, she said, her voice a little steadier than she felt. I was thinking maybe would you like to come over for dinner sometime? I'm trying out a new recipe and, well, it might be more fun to share it with someone. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a moment of silence that stretched far longer than she expected. Anxiety tightened in her chest. Maybe this was a mistake. Then he spoke, his voice filled with that same easy warmth. I'd love that, Anne. I'll bring wine. How about Friday? She smiled, a wave of relief washing over her. Friday sounds perfect. As she hung up the phone and leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding in her chest. There it was, she'd done it. She'd crossed a line she wasn't sure she could ever uncross. Now it's real. And despite the fear and uncertainty, a flutter of excitement stirred deep within her. Friday seemed like an eternity away, but a knew one thing for certain. She had opened the door to something new. What would happen next? She couldn't say, but she was ready to find out. Friday evening arrived, and Anne's house felt both too quiet and too alive. She had spent the entire afternoon preparing, wanting everything to be just right. She was nervous, of course, more nervous than she'd been in years, but there was something else, too. Anticipation. This was a new chapter, one she hadn't expected, and yet here it was. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and garlic, a dish she knew would appeal to both of them. She'd spent hours chopping vegetables, stirring sauces, and making sure every detail was perfect, though she hardly cared if the meal itself turned out flawless. It was the presence of Liam, the idea of him sitting at her table, that mattered most. When the doorbell rang, Anne's heart skipped a beat. She took a deep breath, smoothing down the blouse she'd chosen. A simple, soft blue that made her feel comfortable, yet elegant. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, least of all Liam, but she wanted to feel confident. She had earned that. Opening the door, she found him standing on the other side, a bottle of wine in hand and a bright, disarming smile on his face. The sight of him took her breath away. He wasn't just young and handsome. There was a warmth to him, an energy that felt like sunlight streaming into her dimly lit world. He looked casual, yet polished, jeans and a soft sweater, the sleeves rolled up just so. "Evening," and he said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "Evening," she replied, feeling a little flustered as she stepped aside to let him in. "I'm so glad you could come." As he entered, his presence seemed to fill the space, and Anne realized for the first time in a long while how much she missed the sound of laughter, the presence of someone who cared about more than just the surface of things. "Smells amazing," Liam said, placing the bottle of wine on the counter. "What did you make?" "Chicken with roasted vegetables." "I thought I'd try something new," she said, gesturing toward the table where she had set two places. The small dining room was intimate, lit only by the soft glow of candles. Liam walked over and leaned in to sniff the dish. "You didn't have to go all out, you know," he said, though there was a playful edge to his voice. And laughed, a soft, genuine sound that surprised her. It felt natural with him, like they'd known each other far longer than they had. "I wanted to. It's just been a while since I've cooked for someone." As they sat down at the table, the conversation flowed easily. They spoke about everything and nothing. His work, her memories of raising her children, their shared love of old movies. Each word, each laugh felt like a thread weaving them closer, and Anne found herself forgetting the age gap between them, forgetting the boundaries she'd spent so much time drawing. The moment came when Liam reached across the table to refill her glass, his hand brushing hers just for a second. It was a simple gesture, an everyday act. But in that instant, something shifted. The air between them seemed to thicken, and Anne felt a pull in her chest, something that wasn't simply the excitement of a pleasant evening. It was a deeper, more unfamiliar feeling, a quiet longing that she had tried so hard to suppress. She met his gaze then, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was a tension in the space, an unspoken understanding that hovered in the air like electricity. His eyes, warm and direct, held hers, and Anne's breath caught in her throat. "Anne," he said softly, his voice lower than usual, "I've really enjoyed our time together. More than I expected." Her heart skipped at his words, and something inside her trembled. She could feel the weight of the moment, of everything that had led them here, and everything that could come after. "I'm glad," she whispered, her voice a little unsteady. It wasn't just the wine that made her feel this way. It was him. It was the connection between them, something that went beyond age or expectations. Before she could say anything more, Liam reached across the table again, this time taking her hand in his. His touch was gentle, warm, and surprisingly intimate. It was the simplest of gestures, but it felt monumental. Anne's pulse quickened, and she felt a wave of emotion flood through her, a mixture of desire and fear, hope and uncertainty. This was it. This was the moment where things could change forever. "I'm glad I came," Liam said, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles. And in that simple moment, she knew it wasn't just the dinner or the wine he was referring to. It was the connection they had, the quiet understanding that they were on the same page, even if neither of them knew exactly what came next. And squeezed his hand lightly, her heart pounding in her chest. The evening was far from over, But in that brief, intimate touch, she knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, she had taken a step into the unknown. And for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. As the evening wore on, the sounds of their laughter and conversation filled the house, pushing back the shadows that had long made her home feel empty. Liam had a way of drawing her in, making her feel seen in ways she hadn't realized she'd missed. The clink of glasses and the shared smiles carried with them a warmth and hadn't known she was craving. But as the night drew to a close and Liam stood up to leave, a quiet realization washed over her. She was standing at a crossroads, and everything about what she felt, what they felt, seemed so new, so different from anything she'd known. And yet, in that quiet stillness between the last sip of wine and the closing of the door, something inside her stirred. She walked him to the door, and as they stood there in the soft light of the hallway, he kissed her, gently, tenderly, as though he were afraid she might disappear the moment he held her too close. And stood there for a long moment afterward, her heart racing, her pulse humming in a way it hadn't in years. As she closed the door behind her, she leaned against it for a moment, closing her eyes and breathing deeply, allowing the weight of the night to settle. She could still feel the warmth of his lips, the steady rhythm of his breathing in her chest. Love had always seemed so far away for her, a distant memory from another life. Years of marriage, the heartbreak of losing her partner, the solitude of raising children alone, and had spent most of her life believing that love, for her, was a chapter that had ended long ago. But now, with Liam, there was something that felt entirely different. Something she hadn't expected. She stood there for a long time, lost in thought, letting the quiet of the night settle over her. She thought about age, about the years that had passed and the lines that had appeared on her face, the changes that had taken place both inside and out. She was no longer the young woman she once was, but somehow in this moment, that seemed irrelevant. Liam hadn't looked at her with pity, hadn't treated her as if she were a relic of a bygone era. He'd seen her, really seen her, for everything she was, strong, independent, full of life, and, yes, full of desire. The realization hit her like a sudden wave. Age was just a number, and what truly mattered was the connection between two people. She thought about all the judgments she had feared, the whispers of society about what was appropriate, what was normal. There would be those who disapproved of their age difference, those who would question her choices. But the truth was, and no longer cared. She had spent so many years making herself small, worrying about the opinions of others. But with Liam, she had found something unexpected, something she had forgotten was even possible. She had found her own voice again, her own worth, and a love that was honest and real. And smiled to herself, knowing this moment was a gift, a reminder that love could still surprise her, even at this stage of her life. And as she stood there, contemplating what the future might hold, she realized that love, in all its forms, was ageless. There would be challenges ahead, doubts to be confronted, and perhaps even sacrifices to be made. But for the first time in years, and felt brave enough to face them, she was ready to embrace this unexpected chapter, to live boldly and fully, without fear of the years that had passed or the ones that lay ahead. She would follow her heart, no matter the obstacles. As she moved away from the door and began to clean up the remnants of the evening, she thought about Liam again, the way he had looked at her as if she was the only woman in the world. She realized that she didn't need to have all the answers right now. What mattered was that she had stepped into this new chapter with open arms, and she was willing to see where it would take her. Love, after all, wasn't bound by time. It was bound by the heart, and hers had never felt more alive. The days that followed felt different, lighter somehow, filled with the promise of what might come next, and found herself thinking about Liam in ways she hadn't allowed herself to think about anyone in years. At first, there had been hesitation. A part of her questioned if she was being foolish, if this was just a fleeting infatuation or a distraction from the reality of her life. But as the days passed, that doubt faded, replaced by a deep certainty that this was something real. The calls, the messages, the laughter during their conversations, these were not mere moments of passing time. They were building blocks, the foundation of something neither of them had expected but both had desperately needed. And for Anne, it was a gentle reminder that life was still full of surprises, that love, at any age, could come when you least expected it, turning everything you knew upside down. Her friends, those who had once told her that it was time to settle into her quiet life, raised their eyebrows when they heard about Liam. Some offered well-meaning advice, others asked cautious questions, and no longer felt the need to defend herself. The truth was simple. She was happy. And happiness, she realized, could not be bound by societal norms or the judgments of others. She had spent much of her life living for others, raising children, managing expectations, holding her family together. Now, she was learning to live for herself, to seek out what brought her joy and fulfillment. And Liam, with his gentle ways, his curiosity, and his kindness, had become a part of that journey. When they spent time together, whether it was cooking dinner, taking walks, or simply sharing a quiet moment over coffee, and saw the world through a different lens, she remembered what it was like to feel desired, to feel important in someone else's life. She had spent years in solitude, but now there was a new warmth filling the spaces of her heart that had once felt cold. With Liam, the age difference that once seemed like an insurmountable barrier was no longer relevant. What mattered was the connection, the way they understood each other in ways no one else did. She had always been the caretaker, the one who gave and gave without asking for anything in return. But with him, she felt cherished, not out of obligation, but because of the deep respect he had for her, and knew that there would be obstacles ahead. Society's whispers, their differing stages in life, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She was willing to face whatever came, because the joy she felt in her heart was worth the risk. She was willing to love, regardless of how others might view it. She thought about her past and the experiences that had shaped her into the woman she was today. The loss, the heartache, the quiet years that had passed her by. But none of those things defined her anymore. Love, real, pure love, had awakened something in her that she had forgotten existed. And that love had nothing to do with age, with what others thought, or with what society deemed appropriate. It was about two souls finding each other and connecting on a deeper level, without fear or hesitation. As she looked out the window at the world beyond, and smiled, knowing that this was only the beginning. There were still so many chapters to be written, so many moments to share. And whatever came next, she was ready for it, ready to embrace the love that had found her when she least expected it, and ready to live her life fully, without regret or fear. Love, and realized, was timeless, and it could begin at any stage in life. It was never too late.